think you might have been the most anxious of the four to get out. I get that impression from reading about it.
Maybe, yeah. Just to get out the tunes I had in 1965.
Were you held down by the other fellas?
Well, very subtly, yes.
You know George Harrison as the quiet Beatle, the gentle soul who stood in the shadows while the world adored his bandmates. But what you don't know is the storm he carried inside. Behind that calm smile was a heart scarred by betrayals and disappointments he never forgave. He kept a list of those who hurt him most. And once you uncover it, you'll never see him the same way again. The quiet Beatle with a heavy heart. To millions watching from afar, Harrison was the thoughtful one, the man who seemed content to stand in the background while John Lennon and Paul McCartney took center stage. Yet behind this calm image was a story far more complicated. George carried a heart full of wounds that shaped his journey, leaving him with unspoken frustrations and grudges that stayed with him for life. The nickname Quiet Beatle did not come from his personality alone. Just before the Beatles' legendary debut on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9, 1964, George suffered from a severe throat infection. Doctors ordered him to rest his voice completely, and in the days leading up to the broadcast, he was barely able to speak. When the night arrived, the band made history as their music swept across America. To the audience, George appeared shy and silent, almost mysterious. That one performance cemented the image of him as the quiet one, a label that would follow him for decades. But quiet did not mean weak or submissive. George, born on February 25, 1943 in Liverpool, was thoughtful and careful with his words. He was often slow to anger, but deep inside, he had strong convictions. While the world admired his calm nature, George felt overlooked within the Beatles themselves. He worked tirelessly on his music, writing songs filled with meaning, yet he was rarely given more than 2 or 3 spots on an album. This pattern of neglect stretched across the band's most important years, from their rise in 1963 with Please Please Me to their final works in 1969 and 1970. On albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver, George's contributions were overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney's dominance. Even when he produced gems such as While My Guitar Gently Weeps in 1968, the recognition still fell short. Every time his songs were dismissed, George's disappointment grew heavier. The industry treated him as though he was only a guitarist and not a true songwriter, despite the depth and sincerity of his music. The media added to his frustration by rarely mentioning his creative work, focusing instead on John and Paul. What the world could not see was how these small cuts piled up, leaving scars that never truly healed. By the time the Beatles reached their peak in the late 1960s, George's inner conflict was clear. These wounds, left unchecked, began to harden into resentment. They shaped how George saw others, even those he once admired or loved. But who were the people that truly broke his trust and respect? You'll be surprised to learn the first name on his hate list was once his greatest idol, Elvis Presley. For George Harrison, music became a lifeline the moment he heard Elvis Presley. It was the mid-1950s in Liverpool, and George was still a boy riding his bicycle through the streets when a sound floated out of a nearby house. It was Heartbreak Hotel, released in 1956, and it struck him like lightning. He later admitted that just a few notes changed everything for him. Elvis quickly became more than a singer to George. He represented a new kind of freedom, a rebel with a guitar who could break boundaries that once seemed untouchable. The swagger, the voice, and the sheer rawness of Elvis gave George a vision of what life could be. Alongside John, Paul, and Ringo, he grew up watching Elvis redefine popular music. For George, Presley was the first idol, the one who showed him that a teenager from an ordinary background could command the world with nothing but a guitar and a voice. As the Beatles rose to fame in the early 1960s, the shadow of Elvis was always present. George often spoke of how deeply Presley's music had stirred him as a child. The Beatles themselves were once thrilled to meet Elvis at his Beverly Hills home in 1965, though that night was casual and friendly. But years later, when George met Elvis again, the experience carried an entirely different weight. By the 1970s, Elvis was no longer the lean, rebellious figure George had admired as a boy. Instead, he was performing in Las Vegas, dressed in glittering white jumpsuits, surrounded by backing singers and brass sections that drowned out the simplicity of the music George had once loved. The purity of the young rock and roll rebel seemed to have been replaced by a polished show designed for spectacle rather than soul. George confided to friends that he had wanted to tell Elvis to strip it all back, to put on jeans and a black shirt, and to play with the raw energy he once had. To George, the trumpets and the glitter were barriers hiding the spirit of the music that had first inspired him. When these words eventually reached Elvis, his reaction was far from warm. With a cold smile, Presley reportedly remarked that if George thought he would go back to playing in small bars to please someone, then he clearly did not understand Elvis Presley. That moment marked the end of George's dreamlike image of his idol. The boy who had once been transformed by Heartbreak Hotel was now staring at a man who seemed lost in the very showbiz world George disliked. For Harisson, it was not anger so much as sorrow, a painful recognition that his hero was no longer the same person he had admired. The magic of Elvis, the rebel who had changed his life, had disappeared beneath the weight of stardom and excess. If losing faith in Elvis was painful, what happened next cut even deeper, because it involved someone George once called his brother. Paul McCartney. George Harrison and Paul McCartney's story began in the simplest of ways. They were just two boys riding the same bus to school in Liverpool. George was younger, quieter, but his passion for the guitar caught Paul's attention. They would sit side by side, trading chords, testing out songs, and pushing each other to improve. Those early days built a bond that felt like family. Paul often referred to George as his kid brother, a phrase that made George feel part of something larger than himself. Together with John Lennon, they began shaping the dream that would later become the Beatles. For a time, the partnership worked. They laughed, practiced until their fingers ached, and shared the same hunger to break free from ordinary life. But as the band's fame grew, the balance within their friendship shifted. By 1967, when Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released, and Paul's creative vision began to dominate nearly every decision. His talent for arrangement and his constant drive to perfect every song put him at the center of the group's direction. George, who had been working hard on his own songwriting, started to feel pushed to the side. This sidelining became a wound that deepened over time. George's songs were often overlooked in favor of Lennon and McCartney's work. Even when he brought songs filled with meaning and originality, they were rarely given the same space on an album. It was as though no matter how much he grew as a songwriter, he could never break through the wall of Paul's influence. For someone as sensitive and thoughtful as George, this lack of recognition cut deeply. The frustration reached its peak during the sessions for Abbey Road in 1969. Paul, always meticulous and often controlling in the studio, tried to shape George's music in ways George could not accept. For once, George refused to stay quiet. He stood firm against Paul's suggestions and made it clear he would not allow his songs to be molded into something they were not. The tension between them was obvious, and George's defiance revealed the years of resentment that had built up. One of George's most stinging remarks came when he said he would rather have Willie Weeks, a session bassist, play on his songs than Paul. He acknowledged Paul's greatness as a bass player, but admitted that working with him could feel overpowering. To George, Paul's talent often came with control, leaving little room for his own voice. He later confessed in interviews that Paul had ruined him as a guitarist, a statement that revealed just how much strain their relationship had carried. Yet even with all the bitterness, George admitted there was still a bond he could not deny. Beneath the anger and frustration, there remained a connection formed in those early days on the bus, when music was nothing more than two boys dreaming together. It was complicated, painful, and filled with tension, but it was also unbreakable in its own way. But if Paul was frustrating, John Lennon became something else entirely, a painful thorn in Harrison's side. John Lennon. In the earliest days of the Beatles, George Harrison looked up to John Lennon. He admired John's sharp wit, fearless attitude, and the creative spark that seemed to flow out of him without effort. To the young George, John was more than a bandmate. He was a figure to emulate, someone who could take command of a room with nothing but words and a guitar. That admiration gave George a sense of belonging when the Beatles were still carving their place in the world. As the years passed, however, the admiration began to crack. John's presence in the band was powerful, sometimes overwhelming, and George often felt small in his shadow. When George brought new songs or ideas into the studio, John rarely gave him the respect he longed for. His responses were short and cold, sometimes dismissive to the point of cruelty. Once, when George shared a song he had worked hard on, John brushed it off with the simple remark, "It's fine, but it's not something I'd listen to." Words like that left scars, especially for someone who wanted to be recognized as more than just the quiet one. The divide widened when George began to explore Indian music and spirituality in the mid-1960s. For him, it was a path of peace and meaning, something that brought depth to his life beyond the fame and noise. John, however, often mocked George's devotion. During one studio session, when George tried to explain the spiritual meaning behind a lyric, John cut him off, saying he did not want to hear about those Indian saints again. To George, this felt like a dismissal not only of his art, but also of something deeply personal. By the late 1960s, their interactions had grown cold. Conversations that once carried humor and friendship became short and tense. George kept his distance, and the warmth between them faded. When he later published his memoir, I, Me, Mine, he made the striking choice to almost completely omit John's name. That silence spoke louder than any criticism. It was as if George believed that leaving John out entirely would show more truth than words ever could. When asked about it, George simply said that some things did not need to be mentioned. Even so, when John was murdered in December 1980, George's reaction was honest and deeply human. He mourned him without pretending that their past had been perfect. He did not rewrite history with false sentiment. Instead, he admitted that John had been difficult, often selfish, but he also recognized that he had once been an important part of his life. His grief was not polished or exaggerated. It was real, filled with the weight of unresolved conflict and the sadness of a connection that could never be repaired. Lennon was not the only figure to spark George's bitterness. Outside the Beatles, his sharp tongue struck even rock legends, rock icons who disappointed him. In 1992, during a conversation with Bob Geldof, George revealed a side of himself few had seen. When Neil Young's name came up, he did not hesitate. George admitted openly that he could not stand Young's music. His main complaint was not about the songwriting, but the very sound of his voice. He said it grated on him, calling it worse than his own, which was a rare moment of self-deprecation wrapped in sharp criticism. George went further. He mimicked Neil's guitar solos, mocking the way they dragged on without purpose, and laughed at what he saw as a lack of direction in the playing. These were not casual comments made in passing. They revealed something deeper in George's character. He could not tolerate what he considered careless or unrefined. For him, music had to be sincere, not indulgent. That same year, fate put them on the same stage at the Bob Dylan 30th anniversary concert, known as Bob Fest. Dozens of legends gathered, but backstage, George and Neil kept their distance. Neil handled it with grace, smiling and praising the Beatles publicly. But George remained cool and distant, showing that the divide was real. While George's dislike of Neil Young was rooted in musical taste, his feelings toward Pete Townshend of The Who came from a place far more personal. George valued spirituality as something sacred, something that had to be lived with complete honesty. He had dedicated himself to Indian philosophy and music, believing it could guide a person beyond the material world. When he saw Pete speaking about Meher Baba and weaving spiritual language into the rock opera Tommy, George was not impressed. To him, it looked like theater, not faith. He described Townshend as someone always under the influence, talking about religion without truly living it. In George's eyes, that was unforgivable. The tension was complicated further by matters of the heart. Pete had quietly encouraged Eric Clapton in his pursuit of Pattie Boyd, George's first wife. Clapton's obsession with her inspired the classic song Layla, and though George and Eric remained friends in a strange way, the involvement of Townshend left another scar. For George, this was not just about music or religion. It was about trust, loyalty, and the painful realization that even those who seemed close could play a part in betrayal. But it wasn't just legendary rockers who angered him. The next feud took him into a war of words with an entirely new generation of musicians. Britpop clashes and Elton John's contradictions. By the 1990s, a new wave of British music was rising, and at the heart of it was Oasis. The Gallagher brothers, especially Liam, carried themselves with a mix of arrogance and confidence that reminded many of the Beatles in their early days. Fans and journalists alike drew comparisons between the two bands, framing Oasis as the heirs to the Beatles' legacy. For George Harrison, however, the connection felt hollow. When asked about Liam Gallagher, George dismissed him with brutal honesty, saying that without a microphone in hand, Liam was nothing more than excess baggage. The remark made headlines across music magazines and television interviews. For Liam, known for his fiery temper, George's comment was not something he could ignore. He shot back quickly, calling George a clown and adding that if he ever saw him face to face, he would say it straight. To Liam, George was out of touch with the modern music scene. To George, Oasis represented hype without depth. The exchange symbolized more than just a spat between two musicians. It revealed the generational gap between the Beatles, who had transformed music in the 1960s, and the Britpop movement that built its identity in the 1990s. What could have been a symbolic handshake between eras instead turned into a public clash of words. While George could be openly dismissive of Liam Gallagher, his relationship with Elton John showed another side of him. To the public, the two appeared to be friends. They performed together and were often seen at the same events. But behind the smiles, George carried strong opinions. In a 1976 interview, he bluntly said that Elton's music was something he never thought much of, claiming that every song sounded the same. He went further, suggesting that Elton relied on a formula, lyrics, 4 chords, and a melody to produce hits. For George, who valued authenticity above all, this approach was disappointing. Yet their story was not simply one of criticism. In private moments, George showed that he cared for Elton as a person, even if he did not admire his music. At a party filled with laughter, lights, and excess, George looked Elton in the eye and told him to cut down on the marching powder. a clear reference to a harmful substance. In a room full of people too polite or afraid to speak the truth, George was the only one willing to say it. He spoke not as a rival, but as someone concerned for Elton's well-being. This paradox defined their relationship. George could dismiss Elton's songs as repetitive and uninspired, yet still act as a voice of honesty when Elton needed it most. Elton, for his part, never lashed back publicly. Instead, he later described George as wise, someone who had found something greater than fame. Their bond was complicated, a mix of criticism and care, distance and respect. These clashes and contradictions revealed George Harrison's true nature. He could be harsh when he felt art lacked sincerity, but his honesty came from a place of conviction rather than cruelty. Which feud surprised you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to know what you think.